Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon for those of you in Europe and beyond. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this virtual seminar to discuss an exciting new paper that has been released by the International Tax Investment Center, of which I am president. My name is Dan Witt. The paper, Securing Capital Investment in Ukraine's Grid, the Road to the Future. All of you will receive a link to download this paper shortly after the call, sometime today, as well as a link to the recording, and we hope that you may share this with your colleagues. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be joining with my longtime friend Morgan Williams, the president of the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council, to jointly organize today's event. Before I turn it over to Morgan, let me just share a couple of words about this paper to kind of set the stage. We have the two co-authors, Ariel and Vladislav, and they will go into more detail. But this paper is an ideal fit for the new Energy Growth and Security Project. And I say new, it's been going on now for 2 years, this new project at ITIC, because this paper in this issue with Ukraine's electricity grid addresses those three pillars: energy, growth, and security. And the competitiveness of Ukraine's grid is not just a matter of reliability for end users, but really it's one of national security and the country's development prospects. In the current state of Ukraine's aging Soviet-era grid is a major impediment to industrial development and indeed the quality of life. And to modernize the grid and to guarantee affordable and reliable energy access for the people of Ukraine and the business and industry in Ukraine, you've got to have the right regulatory regime. And that's one of the solutions we're discussing in our paper, is how to develop a new set of transparent, level playing field rules of the game. And it's fundamentally based on a regulatory asset-based tariff regime. The authors will go more into that. And this is important because when you set the rules of the game, you want to create incentives to follow the rules and to benefit the state, to benefit the people. But at the end of the day, it's a profit-making business that requires massive investment. So have you created a regime that will incentivize not only the expansion and the modernization, but something that's also been forgotten in many of the old Soviet countries has been the maintenance and the repair. So this is an exciting paper because it touches on all of those dimensions. And I will stop there because I want to leave it to the authors who really know. And now I will turn it over to our co-host, Morgan Witt.
Dan, thank you very much. On behalf of the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council, we're very pleased to have this opportunity to work with you on this very important event. The U.S.-Ukraine Business Council was started in Washington 25 years ago, so we're celebrating 25 years of working for a better business environment in Ukraine. And we know that you and Ed and Ariel and Vladislav and Artur, I think everybody on today has been working for Ukraine for 25 years or more. We can see that there's still so much that needs to be done. But we thank all of you for being willing to speak up. The U.S.-Ukraine Business Council, we work with real business. We work with people who take risk, who put skin in the game. We appreciate those who will tell the truth and who will push reforms. And I know, Dan, you've been pushing for level playing fields and fair taxes and better business environments all over the world for a long time. So this is very important. This is not blah, blah, blah. This is not business as usual. This is how to move forward. This is how to make things happen. This is how to improve the lives of the people of Ukraine. So it's very, very important. So thanks again to all the panelists. And as I said before, Ariel and Ed and you and I have been working closely together for a long time, and hopefully we'll be able to continue for a long time. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you, Morgan. And you're so right. This is a topic where the rubber hits the road. And to take us through that, I'll turn over to my dear friend and colleague, Ariel Cohen.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's a pleasure to head the Energy Growth and Security Program at ITIC. I think the mission of free markets and security for investments and for countries and for people who benefit from the investments is our key mission. And in the case of this paper, looking at the grid in Ukraine, I think, as Dan said, the mission is implemented here and now. Secondly, I want to thank Morgan Williams. Morgan is my hero. I'm always so impressed by Morgan's positivity. I think that's his Kansas roots. And by his commitment, he built the Business Council in the adverse environment. Ukraine is not an easy place to do business. Thank you very much, Morgan. Also, thanks to Vladislav Inozemtsev is a lead economist on all things Eastern European and Eurasian. No, that's Morgan, that's not Slava. And it's a pleasure working with you. You're a terrific co-author. So now let's get to the business. The story of Ukraine is both the story of missed opportunities and the future promise, including in the electricity sector. The Ukrainian generation capacity and the grid were built mostly in the Soviet era, in the 60s and the 70s, and even before that. Actually, in terms of generation, my father was among those who discovered the famous Shebelinka gas field back in early 60s, I believe. He worked on that in Kharkov. And the Soviet infrastructure is coming to the end of its life. It's obsolescent or obsolete. And both on the generation side, the nuclear reactors that are planned to be decommissioned by the end of this decade, the thermal power stations that were built in the 60s and the 70s, and the grid, they all require billions of dollars of investment, either into the extension of their lives, most probably into decommission. It will be a big challenge with the nuclear. It costs money to dismantle and bury the radioactive parts of the reactor. And also in terms of the grid. The story of the grid today is that the indicator of disruption of electricity that the Ukrainian consumers suffer from is 700 minutes a year versus about 74 minutes in Czechia, in Czech Republic, and only 15 minutes a year in Denmark. So the gap is huge. If you're an investor looking to put your production facility, would you put it in a place where 700 minutes, the SAIDI factor, the interruption factor, or 70 minutes? Or I think Poland is in between with 100 and some minutes. So clearly, Ukraine needs to invest to modernize the grid. The second issue is this: the Europeans demand from Ukraine, as a part of the association agreement, that Ukraine needs to integrate the grids. The grids need to link with Europe, to disconnect from Russia. So they will integrate by 2025. They will disconnect from Russia if all goes well, by 2023. They need a new grid for that, or great improvements in the grid. But also the Europeans are demanding that the nuclear reactors will be decommissioned as they're being decommissioned elsewhere in Europe, and that the polluting coal-fired plants will be also decommissioned. So what is left? What is left is renewables. And one bright spot in Ukraine is renewables. When the pretty high feed-in tariff, the money that is paid to the producers, high feed-in tariff was introduced. Since then, the renewable sector, solar, wind, etc., grew to 8% of the total generation. That's a great progress for Ukraine. Yes, it is expensive, but this is the future. And to integrate more production capability for the renewables, the grid needs to be smart, meaning it needs to accommodate the intermittency of supply, because the wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun doesn't shine at night. And you need to also to integrate storage. So a lot of computing capacity goes into that grid. What does it also mean? It means that the 21st century electricity for Ukraine is not going to be the old school 20th century electricity. It won't be the Soviet era almost free electricity that allowed people to smelt aluminum or to make pipes or to do other very, very energy inefficient or energy consuming things. For example, per unit of GDP, let's say $1,000, Ukraine is more than 3 times more energy consuming than Poland or Turkey, comparable advanced emerging markets. Ukraine, I remember from my earlier research, I worked on this topic, gosh, for more than 25 years. When I first started in the 90s, Ukraine per unit of production was 10 times as energy intensive as Germany. And the energy-rich Russia today is only 85% of what Ukraine consumes per unit of GDP, meaning Ukraine is 15% less efficient in terms of energy than Russia. So in order to achieve all these strategic goals that are important for Ukraine, independence, security, sovereignty, integration with Europe, diminishing the interruptions, making it attractive to advanced industries, to high tech and IT, to biotech, to taking agriculture to the next level. Ukraine needs a modern grid, and the estimates vary. By the Ukrainian think tanks, the estimates are we need between $6 to $17 billion to bring the Ukrainian grid into the 21st century. What does it mean? It means that economically, the investment in the grid has to make sense. If the return on the grid is lower, the return of investment in the grid is lower than your national bank bond, people will bank bonds to diminish the risk and will not invest in the grid. So the investment in the grid has to be more profitable than just buying the bonds. And this is true throughout Europe. And I would, in a minute, ask my co-author, Vladislav Inozemtsev, to expand on that, to explain to us what the tariffs are and what RAB is. But suffice it to say that many countries in Europe made this transition. Czech Republic, Romania, even Georgia, all made transition to RAB, and there are no great complaints. What is important, how uniform it is, does it apply to legacy assets or to the current assets or both, And I would ask Slava to expand on that. Finally, I would like to say that the government is, as usual in Ukraine, not exactly rushing to implement these tariff reforms. In fact, they're dragging their feet for 10 years now. Why? Because they're competing groups of oligarchs pulling this carriage into different directions. In our opinion, the time to do the reform is now. The COVID crisis is the time when there is excess of electricity. Prices for electricity and consumption are actually going down because people don't travel, people don't shop as much, people don't buy as much, so the production is lower. So now is the time to push through the reform. The regulator makes their decisions pretty much now, and this is the time to take Ukraine into the 21st century in terms of its electrical sector. Thank you, and now to you, Slava. Slava?
Okay, yeah, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. And thank you all for organizing this discussion. I'm very grateful for everybody. So I would like to expand some Ariel's arguments about the issue because definitely the main rationale behind this reform is to improve the technical capacity of Ukrainian electrical system and Ukrainian grid, because as Ariel pointed out earlier, it's very outdated and actually it's in some cases, it's staying on the brink of collapse. So therefore, billions of dollars or euros should be taken into this sector in coming years, just to adjust it for current challenges, actually, because there is not only the outdated system, there are new requirements which are caused by the rise of the renewable energy, as Ariel also pointed out. And so there are different and multiple challenges which Ukrainian grid is facing. So what I would like to say about some particular issues. First of all, the main idea of the paper, of our report, is that it's time to implement what is called the regulatory asset-based approach, or RAB, to the Ukrainian electrical system. It was implemented all over Europe. The pioneer in this case was United Kingdom in mid-90s. And since then, it actually was implemented in most of the Western European countries and in the Central Europe as well. Also in Georgia and even Russia made some experiments with this. And actually it implemented the basic elements of the approach under the presidency of Mr. Medvedev. But then as Mr. Putin came back, it was mostly dissolved. But nevertheless, everybody except Belarus, which is a very progressive country, of course, implemented this approach all over Europe. And so Ukraine is the only one which doesn't actually make any attempt to do so. Why it's important and what should be taken into account when you approach the issue? It's important because, as I also said, the investors should be assured for some healthy yields on their investments. And till now, Ukrainian electricity system was largely, I would say, administrated by the government. The prices were fixed. There was a huge cross-subsidizing when the industry paid much more for their electricity, and for part of this payment went to the households for covering their, I would say, excessive electricity payments. So anyway, all this should be abandoned, and the real market system should be implemented. The first step was actually made last year, and this is a big and good ground for going forward, because last year the wholesale market of the electricity was actually introduced in Ukraine after around 9 years of debates, and this. While almost everybody said that it will cause the huge hike in prices, in fact, the prices declined by around 15% immediately after the reform was introduced. And now, during this COVID-19 pandemic, they went further down. So therefore, I would say that the market elements are already in place. And now the next step is to ensure investors about the healthy rates of return. The main idea behind this RAB system is to find out a kind of compensation mechanism which links the return on investment to both, I would say, the current yields on government bonds and on some premium, which is calculated in different formulas in different European countries. The major issue now, I would say there are two most important issues in implementing this case in Ukraine. First, it's about applying this rate of return to both old assets or legacy assets and the new investment, because the Ukrainian government for several years actually proposed to apply this new method only to the new investment, which is, I would say, not very efficient, just because no one will actually buy this idea because the major electricity system, the major generating facilities and the grid, they need money just to repair themselves, to modernize the infrastructure, and not, to get more yield on the current investment. Because if you wish to be involved in Ukrainian energy business with high yield, you will mostly go in renewables, as also Ariel said. So in this case, the most crucial issue is that the rate of return should be unique for old and new assets. It's crucial. And this is also now debated in both Ukrainian parliament and different Ukrainian ministries and regulators. The second point is that the huge difference between, actually, I would say, between the Central European countries and Ukraine is that during the recent years, Ukrainian financial system was largely unstable. Because if you look on the experience of introducing the RAB system in either Bulgaria, for example, or Romania, or even Georgia, you will see that the exchange rates are much more stable and the yields on government bonds are much lower than those in Ukraine. So therefore, I would say, and we propose this in our paper, is to maybe link somehow this rate of return to the exchange rate at least. And maybe because if another issue is, and I will come to it, is the renewables, and the surge in renewables in Ukraine was actually due to the initial move of the government, which installed quite high purchasing prices for electricity made from renewable sources, and pegged these prices to euros. And the result was 6.5 billion euros, which were brought into Ukrainian renewable sector in the last 10 years. So maybe the Ukrainian government should consider somehow linking the new rate of return to the more stable currencies than the Ukrainian hryvnia is. But anyway, the major idea of our report is to encourage the Ukrainian regulators and the Ukrainian expert community to come to terms with the idea of RAB regulation, and to impose it and to allow it to happen as soon as possible, because now we are in the middle of the crucial debate between Ukrainian experts and authorities on this issue. Then another point which is very important is the debate whether this approach will result in huge price increases for electricity, because rising prices for electricity itself and for the electricity transmission. So my point, and we also put this into this report, is that this point will not be so crucial, because in the Ukrainian household expenditures, the share of electricity is much less than 3%. And so even the increase will be as much as 15 to 20% as expected. It will not be crucial for the households. And at the same time, it will force the industry, which is highly energy intensive and ineffective, as it was mentioned already, to economize on electricity consumption, and it will be a huge push to modernize, to implement new technologies, much more energy, I would say, using less electric energy for producing the final produce by the Ukrainian industry, which is actually a very, very important issue. And if all other consumer products are concerned, also most of the calculations suggest that it will be less than 2%, or much less than 2% hike in prices if this reform is implemented in this or next year. The last point I would like to mention, which is I think is very important, is that Ukraine has another big problem, because as I didn't mention it, because in Ukrainian energy system, huge private companies and the state-owned companies really coexist these days. And therefore, it's a huge problem, because many state-owned generating companies, they are extremely ineffective. For example, the Centrenergo company, which supplies Kiev and the region with electric energy, is in records losses for several consecutive years. And actually, some of these companies are eyed by investors as a possible privatization bids. And they are of much interest for both Ukrainian and foreign investors. And without these new approaches, they are extremely cheap. And actually, some of the oligarchy groups and some of the expert community members, they oppose these new approaches just because they hope these assets may be bought quite cheap. Our approach is quite different. We say that if this RAB method is implemented, the overall market value of even the state-owned enterprises will go up. And so therefore, if the state decides to sell them off in coming years, the budget can get several times, maybe even 10 times more money than under the current conditions. Because actually, even if to say more, I would say that Ukrainian stock market, actually, which was in the state of, appearing in the mid-90s, it simply doesn't exist these days, because there is no many companies on the stock exchange. The trades are very rare and so on. And actually, to put all this generation and grid system into the market via privatization efforts is quite equal to creating a modern Ukrainian stock market as well. So just to summarize, I would say that the topic is very much diverse, and if this reform is introduced, I would say there would be a lot of positive developments in the Ukrainian market. Not only the renovation of the grid, not only the much more opportunities for the green energy to prosper, not only I would say new investment attracted from both Ukrainian and foreign investors, but much more systemic issues like new push for privatization, because since famous sell-off of the Kryvyi Rog metal processing facility in 2005, it's actually stalled. It may give a huge push for creation of modern stock market, and actually it will make the whole Ukrainian system much more transparent and market-oriented. So therefore, once again, to repeat, I would say that this is a very timely measure, and so therefore we are advocating it very strongly. Ariel?
Well, Vladislav, thank you for that very succinct summary, and really a an excellent cataloging of the diverse benefits that a change of the tariff regime, that the RAB, you mentioned stability if it's linked with exchange rates, the affordability for the retail, the individual Ukraine citizen, and of course the incentive for energy conservation. But the last point about listing these companies and ensuring a market valuation and the secondary benefit of providing depth to the Ukrainian financial markets, capital markets, is something that is very, very difficult to achieve. And this is a real potential game changer. So I think that that needs to be trumpeted even louder, because there are a few things that can achieve that so quickly. You know, it's been a dream since the mid-90s, and they've yet failed to realize it, but this can be a big step. So I would now like to turn to our commenters, and Artur, I know you've got a time constraint, so let us turn to you. You've worked in this practice group in Deloitte. You know this part of the world, and you know the industry. So I think you have some valuable insights. Over to you, sir. We can't hear you, but I see you do not have your mute on. Perfect, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the paper issued, because I believe that kind of
Excuse me, Artur, maybe come a little closer to your microphone, because we're not hearing you clearly.
Excuse me. And thank you for your paper, because I believe that such kind of materials, papers, analytics are exactly what is needed to force the government and the regulator to move faster towards the incentive-based regulation in Ukraine. I'd like to just stress on one point, which is described in your paper, related to the rate of return. As you know, the regulators how it's called in English, I would say regulation, let's say, provides two different types of rate of return: to existing so-called old assets and to new assets. Why it's so? There are some arguments pro and contra. First of all, let's pay attention on the fact that the RAB, regulatory asset base in Ukraine, is not some kind of values from the financial statements, historical value, or maybe indexation of historical value. It's reevaluated asset base, and valuation of the asset base for the distribution, for the operators, is done according to the special methodology of a State Property Fund of Ukraine. It is really a special methodology exactly for this purpose, not for privatization. And the argument of the regulator is that rate of return is rate of return on invested capital, but reevaluated asset base is something different. This is why the regulator is not willing to approve the one single rate. But in any case, I believe that regulation for natural monopolists is based on political will and compromise. In any case, some analysis, some deep modeling is needed in order to say if the proposal of the regulator is acceptable both to consumers and to operator or not. And this is what we cannot see here in Ukraine during almost 8 years from 2012. And now I know that there are some I would say negotiations between the operators and the regulator. We'll see. And once again, thank you. Your paper, I will use it as well in my negotiations with the market participants, including regulator as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Artur, and that's exactly what we want. I mean, ITIC as a nonprofit research and education foundation, I like to think we're far more than a think tank, and the fact that you see the value of our paper to use in discussions with the regulators to change the rules of the game, that tells me mission accomplished with this paper, Vladislav and Ariel. It's a useful tool to shape the rules of the game that will determine whether investments are made or not made. Ed, you now it will, and Artur, it's I understand you've got this time commitment, so you can just, when that magic time hits, feel free to just quietly disappear. And now we'll turn to Ed Chow. Ed, you know business, and you know businesses that require enormous capital investment and a very long period to achieve your break even and your returns. So I think you can shed some very interesting light from your many years in the oil sector, in the energy business. So now to Ed Chow. And thank you. We've got 2 CSIS speakers, including one of our co-authors. So thank you for that collaboration as well. So Ed, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you and Morgan for the kind invitation from ITIC and the Business Council for me to participate in this important and timely discussion. A lot of things have been said, and I won't repeat them in the interest of saving time for our Q&A session. I would just give you some of my takeaways listening to the conversation, as well as my own interpretation of what's going on. I have to say that Ariel Cohen has not been known mainly for diplomatic understatement. But when he said that the Ukrainian authorities had not been exactly rushing into tariff reform, that was truly a understatement. Ariel mentioned Ukraine's obligations under the EU Association Agreement. Let me also remind everyone that Ukraine joined the European Energy Community in 2010. And under both of those agreements, Ukraine accepted the obligation to reform its energy sector and move from an energy system which has been based on command and control to one based on market principles with transparent rules that are not subject to manual control and political manipulation. And this is long overdue. The modernization of the grid is also fundamental to realizing Ukraine's aspirations to integrate with the European market. A modern grid is central to the EU's already announced Green Deal policy. Without a modern grid, not only won't Ukraine be able to enhance its own energy security by integrating itself into the larger European system, but it also risks facing trade barriers to enter its largest export market, that is namely the EU. These are things that are just around the corner. Also remind everyone that since 2014, because of these commitments that Ukraine voluntarily made, Ukraine has received tens of billions of dollars of assistance from the European Union, from international financial institutions, and bilateral donors such as the United States, which are all based on Ukraine fulfilling these commitments. These donors are committed to continue to help Ukraine complete its very long journey to build a market economy with a modern energy system, including by providing technical assistance. There is really no need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to modernizing the regulatory system for energy in order to achieve efficiency and effectiveness and to permit investments in for continual enhancement of the system. There are ample lessons that can be drawn from internationally, including and maybe particularly from Ukraine's European neighbors who have themselves transitioned from a command economy. I think the report that Vladislav and Ariel put together pointed out these examples. There is no uniquely Ukrainian path to reform. If there were one, it would have been discovered a long time ago, over 30 years and 5 previous presidents, and numerous cabinets of ministers. As Dan, you pointed out, energy investments by definition are capital intensive and take a long time to execute and a long time to pay out. They require a stable, predictable, and attractive regulatory regime before they can go forward. What the regulator does in implementing a sensible RAB or regulatory asset-based tariff methodology will be watched very closely by Ukraine's international donors, lenders, and investors, not only in the energy market, but also beyond. Investors look for a risk-adjusted rate of return in order to justify their potential investment. More the regulator can reduce the perceived risk, the more likely investors are to accept a lower rate of return. The more risky the regulatory environment, the higher the potential rate of return investors will demand. I mean, Ariel mentioned a high feed-in tariff for renewables. Well, if you were an investor in the Ukraine's renewable sector the last few years and saw the long dragged out negotiations to come to a compromise on the tariff recently, you would think that maybe the initial feed-in tariff wasn't high enough to justify the investment that was made. So having a tariff methodology set by the regulator in a professional and technically and economically sound manner is really very important. And it has to be made in a way that is not, it doesn't expose the regulator to undue political pressure, which is a particularly sensitive subject today, given the news we heard from Ukraine yesterday. The decision is ultimately Ukraine's to make, but the stakes for going forward with the sensible regulatory reform cannot be higher and clearer. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ed. You certainly reinforce the importance of stable and predictable regulatory regimes. And, as I touched on in my introduction, this is more than just electricity. You mentioned many people are watching. This is critical. Why does the World Bank worry about electricity? It's essential to quality of life. It's essential for industrial development. And if Ukraine is serious about moving down this path of development, this is a crucial reform. And I find it interesting that Vladislav pointed that this isn't just the European way, but you can look east, west, north, and south, and the RAB is being used to price electricity all around Ukraine. So it all too often Ukrainian reforms seem to fall in a east-west struggle. This one should not. So Vladislav, maybe I could turn to you to kind of comment on how this isn't one of the normal Ukrainian fights in a geopolitical sense. And then after you comment, I'd like to turn back to Ariel. Thank you.
Thank you. I will just add a couple of words about this because, look, the problem with Ukraine and Arabian approach actually signifies this, is that unlike the situation in Poland or Hungary or Bulgaria or even Georgia, the reforms in Ukraine have been very slow for all these years. And actually, it just reflects, as Ariel said already, that there are many competing groups, interest groups in the country, and they actually influence the political decision-making, while, for example, in Central European countries, it's much more formalized, and in Russia, it's much more voluntary, but nevertheless, in both cases, the reforms can push forward in a much more better way than in Ukraine. And today, I would say that we already saw that the liberalization of wholesale electricity market made a huge progress last year. And actually, this was a result of 9-year-long debates and decision-making process, and and the Ukrainian economy profited from it a lot. And it actually suddenly was very effective in the terms of energy price because it fell down even before the COVID crisis. And so therefore, I think it was a very good step based on it, to go forward. So the next step actually will also provide quite good results, which we are absolutely sure. And it is very nice moment to make this now, because actually, the timing is, as we said, it's very, very sufficient, because at this point, the prices are low. The moderate increase of the prices will encourage investment, will not hurt the consumers. And actually, this is a major point for making Ukrainian industry to modernize, because it's crucial to push it for modernization from the price point of view and from the point of view of new technologies. Because if it would not happen now, I actually doubt it would happen anytime else.
Well, thank you, Vladislav. And again, I think it's critical that we emphasize the green objective, how this will contribute to energy conservation and a green agenda. And the other point, that let's not look at this, it should not be viewed as a radical reform, but a natural progression of the liberalization of the wholesale electricity market that we saw last year. This is the logical next step. And then my last point is always the challenge is, can this be structured in such a way that it's not so binary? You've got winners and you've got losers. You know, some people will do better, some may do worse, but if there could be some win-win elements, I think that the political calculus may become a little bit easier. So with that a challenge, Ariel, I'll send it back to you.
Thank you, Dan. I would add that the challenge of strategic policymaking has been the challenge of Ukraine for a long time. If you see the 30 years of independence, we're still, 10 plus years behind the peers of Ukraine in Central and Eastern Europe, of the Polands, the Czech Republics, and even Romania, even Georgia, okay? So that's the first thing. The second thing is the mindset that electricity is some kind of a God-given right and not a commodity that needs to be purchased. That's a Soviet mindset that this generation that grew up with independence, if you were born in 1990, you are 30 years old, you have kids already. So that mentality, that mindset needs to be resolved. The third thing is they need to walk and chew gum. You're elected president of a country so that you can multitask. And I don't envy President Zelensky. He has a difficult situation for his country in the East with Donbass, with Putin, who just got himself a lifetime job security for Mr. Putin till 2036. But at the same time, President Zelensky will do well for his country if he addresses the grid issue and the generation capacity issue. And the generation capacity issue is critical, especially in the nuclear sector, because something goes wrong with electricity distribution grid, a factory or a town is without electricity, painful, especially in winter, and bad things happen if your refrigeration doesn't work in a hospital. But if a nuclear reactor goes supercritical, that's a disaster. And they need to address that as well. And as I mentioned before, this is a chance for Ukraine to start playing catch up. We talk about Ukraine playing catch up on policy, on tariffs, playing catch up on electricity. I'm not recommending that Ukraine, with its limited resources, will have 40% of its generating capacity today in renewables, but they need to be on a glide path toward the future. As the Minister of Energy said, maybe 70% by 2050. It's aspirational, it's difficult, it requires building up battery capacity, storage capacity that is expensive today. But who knew 10 years ago that the kilowatt cost of renewables will go down 80% in 10 years. So this is the future. You can modernize some of your nuclear, you can modernize some of your thermal, you can work on gas, not Russian gas, but other gas, maybe American LNG. Yeah, it's more expensive, I know, but security-wise, it probably has a premium if you import via Świnoujście in Poland, American gas, LNG, and then it's piped across Poland into Ukraine. So a lot of challenges, but the Ukrainian people is talented. I was born in what today is occupied Crimea. I was born in Ukraine. I know the people are extremely motivated, talented, and with God's help, they can solve these problems.
Dan, if I could respond to your
Please.
very good point about needing to come up with a win-win formulation. I think the problem is that right now, Ukraine is on a lose-lose trajectory when it comes to the electricity system. I mean, there are literally tens of billions of dollars of unpaid debt, not dollars, but hryvnia of unpaid debt in the electricity system itself, mainly held by state entities, by the way. So, how do you come up with a politically feasible solution to this? I would suggest one of the ways is that you have to do it in a very transparent way so that all the stakeholders have a chance to speak to their issues rather than in the traditional Ukrainian way, which is the stakeholders speaking about their interests behind closed doors rather than publicly. And I also think that it's very important to engage civil society in this exercise. So the methodology can be well understood that is technically sound. I mean, what happens in Ukraine is that people get subsidies in the name of the consumer, but what the consumer gets instead are energy shortages, blackouts, poor services, but other special interest benefit instead. And it's time to break that mold. And it may be painful, but it's painful partly because of the long 30-year delay in transitioning to a market economy. It's not going to get less painful if you delay it. It's only going to get worse. So rather than being in a lose-lose situation, Ukraine's electricity system needs to move to a direction that's sustainable and benefits the overall economy in the end.
Well said, Ed. These issues on any reform always are a challenge in Ukraine. I mean, Morgan, I can't help but think about how long did it take for a Western hotel to get built in Kiev? After, we had so many attempts, so many false starts, and only did that happen several years ago. I mean, there were 20 years with no Western hotel, and the cost of investment for a hotel is a fraction of a new electricity grid. So I think the winners, losers, and the constituencies need to be realigned. Vladislav, we've got time for maybe a last word from you and a quick last word from Ariel, maybe 1 minute each to wrap it up.
I think we covered almost all major issues we raised in our report, and so I'm just want to say that actually I'm quite optimistic because of two major issues. First of all, because of the successful wholesale electricity market reform last year, and because of the huge surge in renewable production we also witnessed in 2018 and 2019, because actually 2/3 of the entire green electricity production which we are now seeing in Ukraine was added just in last 2 years, and more investment is coming in. And as Ariel said, it's quite easy to believe that the price of the green energy may come down, because just several days ago it was agreed between the regulator and the producers that the cuts between 7% and 15% are already done these days, and this doesn't stop the inflow of investment in the sector. So if the market conditions are met, the investment is coming on in. So therefore, I once again will repeat, I'm quite optimistic about the future of Ukrainian grid and Ukrainian energy sector if the market reforms are implemented.
Ariel, over to you.
Well, this may be a former lawyer in me, but I would stress the need for predictability. Once the tariffs are agreed and legislated, don't forget, you have to take some of these tariffs and make them into a law, which is in Ukraine, what's the expression? You don't want to see how two things are done, sausages and laws. But you need to make it into law. You need to write the regulation. It needs to stay that way. Why? Because there is a talk about Ukraine being attractive for foreign investment, and there is practice. And I must say that when I look at cases of foreign investors, especially in the energy sector, not just in grid and electricity, but also oil and gas, for years. The state tariffs and taxes were too high, and the land shifts all the time. So the majors and super majors were pulling out, and even small guys, small companies that invested were harassed and discriminated against. Ukraine should learn from its experience, avoid these mistakes, make itself a real investment magnet with predictable laws and regulations and transparency, so that Western money that is available, there are trillions of dollars throughout the world looking for places to be invested. I know it because I talk to investment advisors and I consult. And Ukraine would be a terrific place to invest if it is transparent and predictable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel, and you're right. You know, capital flows to where it is treated best, and history has shown a predictable, stable, competitive tax regime, a regulatory regime that is not burdensome, not full of red tape, that is transparent, and respect for property rights will attract investment. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I think we've had a rich and lively discussion. And to our listeners, we will share with you the recording, and we hope you will pass it on. We will also be sending you the link to the full study. And please, these are public documents, widely share them by email or social media. With that, we're concluding. Thank you very much.
On time.
Bye now.